Tuolla Lontoossa Jennin mä kohtasin. Halo Vepi, oho. Hän on neidosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo Vepi, oho.
Well, hello and welcome to another adventure of Gloucester Bookies. With me today, this session, is George Rosen. George is almost ready to say hello.
Hello.
He did it.
I did it.
I'm going to tell you stories to start with, perhaps is a good way. We're talking usually about books, borrowing books, writing books, reading books, recommending books, shelving books, giving away books, all kinds of things about books, anything you can do with books. And we're going to do that, and we've got some books to recommend. But I'd also like to tell stories that are not published, that are not in a book. Mine is related to a relative.
Related to a relative.
Always relative. And what happened is I'm very distantly related to Amelia Earhart.
Oh.
All right? You got to follow this. It's like
Okay. Do you know where she is?
You got a great one, because I spent a lot of my childhood figuring that out incorrectly. I figured out she was a Japanese spy and had been taken by the dad, but it was wrong. It was wrong. It's like my own, what is the song? I am my own grandpa kind of thing.
My own grandpa, right.
Here it is. My mother's father, which is my grandfather's brother.
Your granduncle.
My grandfather's brother, my granduncle, was until they passed away, married to Amelia Earhart's sister.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's not that's not a close relative and a blood relative.
But you can call her your great aunt or grand aunt.
And the figures in this little story that I have, that my mother's a Morrissey, and this fellow related who married Amelia Earhart's sister is named Albert Morrissey. Okay. So there was a great to-do, a lot of publicity in, I think, the late 70s, early 80s about Amelia Earhart and the mystery of her disappearance and all kinds of things. It was revived. And there was a biopic. It was like the movie of the week on NBC or ABC, one of the networks, national networks. And in those days, George, you will remember, the networks were everything. It wasn't Cablevision and 1500.
No.
It was like 4 stations and you picked one. So here it is with a national network presenting a movie on Amelia Earhart. And of course, who's in the audience watching it at home in the living room but me? So I'm watching the show as it proceeds to give the early years of Amelia Earhart, which necessarily includes her sister as a close confidant and friend, effectively, as well as a sister. So they're growing up, and Amelia did a stint during World War I as a nurse in Canada. So she's a nurse in Canada, and her sister comes to visit. And the sister comes with some news. And this is in the movie. They're sitting on a park bench, and as scripted, Muriel is the sister's name. Muriel says to Amelia, her sister, "I'm going to get married." Now, parentheses, everybody knows Amelia Earhart, liberation, don't get married, make your own career, everything, but I'm going to marry. And the way they put it in the script was, "I'm going to marry Albert Morrissey." And Amelia's scripted answer in the movie, the actress did a wonderful job. She said, "Oh, Pidge." Pigeon was her sister's nickname. So I had the only time my family's been mentioned on national TV, it was in this movie of Amelia Earhart. And the response to, you're marrying Albert Morrissey, which my response would be, "Yay, great," was, "Oh, Pidge. It was very disappointing. It was disappointing to me. It was disappointing to Amelia at the time, I guess. But anyway, they did get married. They had a long-term, happy marriage, and that's all I'll say about that.
Okay.
Have you an anecdote?
Well, I can tell. I mean, since you brought up distant relatives, I'll tell my only distant one. I have a couple of distant relative stories, but the more interesting and more current one is growing up, I knew that my father had a cousin. That was the only way it was referred to as, could be anybody, but it was somehow connected in some way. Who, and this was the reason why anyone talked about him in my immediate extended family, he had been a major league pitcher for one game in the 1920s. I think he was playing for Washington Senators. And as far as one can figure it out from the Encyclopedia of Baseball, he pitched one inning in one game and gave up 2 hits or something like that. He didn't win or lose the game, which is good, but they still sent him down to the minors, the next day. And he went on. He played professional basketball, such as it was in 1932, which is basically a couple of guys on the weekend from different cities getting together and stuff. But this was a big deal in my family, or at least among the young cousins, was that, we were related to a major league ball player. And he had this great major league ball player name, which was Ed Lefty Wineapple.
Lefty Wineapple.
Lefty Wineapple.
Excellent.
Okay. So, so this is something dear to my heart, that I was related to Ed Lefty Wineapple, and people might doubt it, but they could look it up back in the days when there was, every year or two, they would revise. It's a book story, the Encyclopedia of Baseball, and you could look up Ed Lefty Wineapple, and he was really there. So in the past 10 or 15 years, I start reading the New York Review of Books, and which comes out every week, and it's really good. It comes up with all sorts of interesting books you might not have thought of before and stuff like this.
I remember asking a bookstore if they sold the New York Times. Sunday New York Times has it as a supplement.
Oh, well, it's a different part there. That's the New York Times Book Review. This is a separate magazine called the New York Review of Books. Very big.
New York Review.
It still looks like a big newspaper.
I know what you mean now.
And it still comes out.
Good.
And you can subscribe to it for $10 a year or something
not
like
bad.
that. Anyway, so there start to be some articles by, the first ones I saw, I think it was around the first impeachment of our next president, that a woman who was basically a literary critic had written a book about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And I was mildly interested anyway, but it was by Brenda Wineapple.
Brenda Wineapple, yes.
So I said, this is the first other person I've ever
heard
of with that name of Wineapple. I
Yes.
mean, how many Wineapples are going to be? So I sort of lived with that for a couple of years, and then because I know someone who went to my high school and occasionally writes for the New York Review of Books and stuff, and so I got brave enough to send my friend a letter saying, do you know Brenda Wineapple, who also writes for the New York Review of Books? And she said, yeah, a little bit, and she also teaches at Columbia, and I teach at Columbia and stuff. So I said, so I can mention your name. So I wrote a message to Brenda Wineapple, and she turned out to be Ed Lefty Wineapple's daughter.
Bingo.
So it's right there, and we had a long, wonderful discussion a couple of times trying to find out exactly how we were related, which we were not able to do. I mean, she knew there were Rosens, but it was a different Rosen that they were related to. So that's my interaction with fame. But what I really liked was that name, Ed Lefty Wineapple. I mean,
it's a classic.
He's a ball player.
It's a classic. I right up there with Goose Gossage.
Yeah.
Or somebody like that. Anyway, the Splendid Splinter, Ted Williams. But I'm going to tell a baseball story. You attracted me to tell this one. When I was in the Union, the Union leader had roots in Maine, and especially in the area of Waldoboro, Maine, if anybody knows Waldoboro. And it has one famous baseball person at Waldoboro, he's passed on since, but it was Clyde Sukeforth. Now,
What's that
who
last
would
name?
say
Sukeforth?
Sukeforth. Who would Clyde Sukeforth? People say, I don't know who Clyde Sukeforth is. I told him. He said, I'm going to Maine. Come with me. I'll introduce you to Clyde Sukeforth. And we'd actually have a sit-down and conversation. I said, wow, I'm kind of interested in old-time baseball, and I'd like to do that. But who's Clyde Sukeforth? And he explained. Clyde Sukeforth, among several other things, was the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers at the first game of the, I think it was the 1947 season, when Jackie Robinson, in other words, he's the person whose pencil went on listed Jackie Robinson would be in the lineup in that game. He was the manager. Why was he the manager? Because the real manager, Leo DeRocher, had fallen on, had a little bit with the commissioner of baseball, who removed him for 3 days, suspended him for gambling, I think, in Havana or something. But it was
that's a story I should pursue.
Quite odd. So then when you said, look up in the books, you can see that managers of baseball teams, you'll find Clyde Sukeforth for 3 days, 3 games, was the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Otherwise, he was a coach and pitching coach and things like that. But when he was speaking with us, he had that Maine accent, and I'll try to reproduce it because I just said to him, like spontaneous praise, I said, nobody's ever done more than that. The tremendous steps ahead to being the manager that day, that historic day. Nobody's done more than, nobody's done as great a thing as that. As great a thing as that. He said, well, nobody's done as great a thing as that, but some have done more. He's just there for a couple of days, 3 games. So anyway, we'll proceed now to our books. Okay. You have some in a stack to recommend to folks.
Yeah. And the first one, I will just very briefly recommend and mention, and there's a tie-in possibly with what we just said. I'll do it briefly because it's actually a book of poetry, and there are several books of poetry, which my late wife, Barbara Gale, who's a local Gloucester person, was enchanted by. And the first thing I'll say is that her first cousin, Rich Gale, from New Hampshire, her father's brother's son, was an actual serious baseball player, was rookie pitcher of the year in the American League in the late 70s. Eventually, he was pitching for the Royals, pitching in the World Series that year, and he was on the Red Sox for a while, and he was the pitching coach for the Red Sox for a while as well. So
there it is.
He was a real... And this is sort of like when I was growing up, with this one-day player in the family. There was the MVP in the American League was Al Rosen for the Cleveland Indians, who actually won the Triple Crown, I think, one point as well. But he was no relation to us at all. But
no
me
relation.
And my cousins kind of finessed that a while. We didn't say, if people said, are you related to Al Rosen? We didn't say no, but we're related to Ed Lefty Wineapple.
Speaking of that, that's right.
So, but anyway, this is very briefly because when I first met Barbara, she was enchanted with a Canadian poet. I'll give the name at the end because that's sort of the giveaway. A woman who had published 3 or 4 books of poetry, which were kind of interesting and outstanding. They had a kind of lot of bite to them. This one here called Power Politics. I'll actually just quote a couplet, which is something like, "We fit together." This is something that is often said in love poetry, but it's we fit together like a fish hook in an eye. so there was
Images. Okay.
yeah, so it was a kind of arresting image, and by the time I first met Barbara, this woman had published 3 or 4 books of poetry, and then she started writing novels instead. And her name is Margaret Atwood, and she wrote The Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
Which one is either read or seen on TV or
Yes.
completely overwhelmed culture and
Yes.
and stuff like that. But before she was writing fiction, she was an outstanding young, angry Canadian poet.
And Barbara picked her up at that point as somebody to.
Well, she
somebody
also
to-
Barbara was working for the Atlantic. Well, this one's published by Harper and Row, but a couple of the early volumes are published by the Atlantic Monthly Press, which
Okay.
I don't think exists anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, the Atlantic is a thing, but
Yeah.
and
Right.
so she got free copies.
Terrific.
So
And you can too if you go to the library.
yeah,
I'm just
all the
suggesting.
books I'm mentioning, and even some of the poetry of Margaret Atwood, I have attempted to track down, are available either directly at the Sawyer Free Library or can be picked up, through Noble, through.
Can I impose
The
on
library
you,
exchange,
George, to
yes.
share with the group today the Pinkwater books that you have? Daniel Pinkwater, one of my favorites, who was on NPR many times and listened to. Tell us about Daniel Pinkwater's books that you brought us.
Right. Well, I've got 2 here. And,
Are
Daniel-
they for kids or?
Well, that's the thing. Who is to say? There's, I don't know if it's still true that there are lots of kids or young adult books which really are for everybody, sort of thing.
I've got one, and I'm going to do it too.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Okay, so but Daniel Pinkwater really fits into that situation, and he's written a whole bunch of kids' books, and he grew up in Chicago, and as I did, nearby, and a lot of his books are set in Chicago and also in outer space at the same time, as well.
Good combination.
Yeah, it's a good
It works.
good combination, and he the 2 I have here are Alan Mendelsohn, The Boy from Mars, which I'm
see
pretty
if you
sure
can
is available at a
Show the cover. It's a great one. Yes.
is available at the Sawyer Free Library. This is a library copy, unfortunately, not from the Sawyer Free Library, but from, I think it's the Alameda County Library.
Yes. And it was not purloined.
It was not
actually-
purloined. You can get, it's very sad in some ways, you can get spectacular books. Go to Abe Books or
Library discards.
all these things, and there's just library discards, and they're wonderful things to have. And I was always enchanted, not so much with him because I hadn't met him yet. I first learned about him, as some people may have who are of an age older than, I don't know, probably you could be 30, 35 and know about this. But Daniel Pinkwater used to do little kind of spiels on NPR every so often. And he talked
Often
about,
very humorous, comical things.
And he lived in upstate New York, or lives in upstate New York. We just determined that he's alive at the age of 83, where he is a breeder of dogs, among other things, and all these things. So there are a bunch of these. I recommend Alan Mendel. This other one is Lizard Music.
Oh, show the cover.
Which involves real lizards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When his parents go away for 2 weeks, Victor goes on his own vacation right at home. Now he can order pizza with anchovies. After the late show one night, something very strange happens. A band of lizards appear on the screen, playing the most outrageous music Victor has ever heard. They're not in the TV listings. The networks don't know anything about them, but every night they're there. With the help of the Chicken Man, who keeps a hen named Claudia in his hat, Victor is able to track down the lizards. The journey takes him to Thunderbolt City on a trip that will change the way Victor sees the world forever. Now, the Chicken Man is a character in this, but the Chicken Man is also a Chicago figure.
Yes, based on fact.
Based on fact, yes, and who was very popular on local AM radio. When I was growing up, there would be sightings of the Chicken Man, and there was a particular DJ who knew about him. These are people like, Dick Bianchi and Arnie Ginsberg were sort of the Boston equivalents.
Yes.
Of
we remember Woo Woo. Yes.
These kind of DJs. And the Chicken Man was this guy who basically dressed up as a chicken. I mean, he wasn't advertising anything. It was just he was a man of his own heart. So.
Chicken-hearted.
Yeah. He did not keep a hen named Claudia in his hat. That's Daniel Pinkwater.
But
that's the kind of tale that
poetic license.
Yeah, one of my favorites is which I don't have here. I couldn't find the copy of it at home. Is called Borgel, Borgel, which is about it's kind of like Lefty Wineapple or Amelia Earhart. So it's kind of a distant relative who turns up in the family and keeps referring to the old country, as my immigrant grandparents would talk about the old country and stuff. But it turns out his old country is a planet somewhere off in another galaxy. But he keeps telling all these tales. But that's another one that I would recommend. So I'd recommend really anything by him. But these two are Alan Mendelsohn, Boy from Mars, Lizard Music, and Borgel, Borgel, is the third.
I'm delighted because if anybody is being introduced today, right now, to Daniel Pinkwater, you indicated there's a wonderful series suddenly open to you. Not just one book, not just one. But in my case, I'm going to recommend a book that is just one. It's standalone. It was by an author in Germany that escaped notice. It was under the radar for many years because it was only in German, and most people didn't. I'm gonna get most people weren't ready to crack open a book that started titled Momo oder die seltsame Geschichte von der Zeitdieben und von den Kind, das den Menschen die gestohlene Zeit zurückbrachte. It's not usually a title that you would fly into. But if it's only called, as it is in English now, Momo, you have a chance. You might pick it up. And it's not really that large a book. It's a children's book, but who knows? Is it only for children? It's a fable. And when you get into
isn't he also the author of The Never-Ending Story, which was made into a movie?
You get it. Michael Ende. What do we have for him, Johnny? He's won something here. He's got to be a prize for that. That was wonderful. Yes, The Never-Ending Story. It really is. I was going to say this is the book that's standalone. It's really almost standalone. But what a terrific bookend. There was Never-Ending Story he wrote that was made into the movie. Many people don't know it was a book before it was book. before it was a movie. But this one, Momo, has not yet been made into a book. I mean, it's been made into a book, translated, but it's not been made into a movie yet. And surely when you see these figures of gray men wearing gray suits and topped by gray heads, walking around with clocks and briefcases, you know something's up. You know, we're not in Kansas anymore or Chicago. And this whole thing comes down to, I even had something to read from it to give you the flavor of it. It's a fable that even adults can appreciate, and it's been recommended to me by somebody who was quite adult. In fact, a widely read person who said it was terrific and I should get a hold of it. And once I did, I said, yeah, not only get a hold of it, I want to recommend it to others. This is just a paragraph that gives you a flavor of the translated but well-written text. Momo listened in a way that made slow-witted people have flashes of inspiration. It wasn't that she actually said anything or asked questions that put such ideas into their heads. She simply sat there and listened with the utmost attention and sympathy, fixing them with her big dark eyes, and they suddenly became aware of ideas whose existence they had never suspected. Sometimes we say the power of public speaking, the power of listening. There's a power in listening. And the fable is effectively that if you listen more attentively and with effect, you can change the world, save the world. Listen to each other. And this is what she does as a obsession. It's her thing. She doesn't really work. She does, for the village in which she's living, everyone depends on her to be the listener that they can count on. And the plot develops from there. I won't spoil it, but there's a whole bunch of, what do you call it? When you have a fable, there's a meaning that's relevant to your way of living. It's a criticism. It's a social criticism of the way that people live in the modern times. And it suggests a reform. Reform yourself and get away from that way of living into a better mode. And just so I recommend Momo without question. And it's available in the library. This copy is from the Sawyer Free Library. So I didn't have to buy it. If you buy it, I suppose you could pass it on to your others in your group or family, and they will enjoy it too. Almost, I don't say any age, but certainly probably when they start reading, what do they call them, chapter books?
Yes, so right. I haven't heard that term for a long time, but that's exactly right. Yeah, chapter books.
When they start reading chapter books, you can give them this as a inspiration to keep reading, because it is a wonderful book. And now back to George.
Okay. Well, I've got 2 books left here, and let's see which one I'll talk about a nonfiction book, as we hardly ever do.
Yeah.
Both these books that I've got here are books which I fell in love with 40, 50 years ago.
Same author or different?
Completely different author. They're both nonfiction. That hadn't occurred to me. One is such a wonderful story that I sort of had forgotten that it's genuinely true, though if you look at, well, maybe I'll start with that now since I'm holding it up anyway. It says right on the cover, a true story. It's called The Fruit Palace, which I'll explain in a minute. It's by a man named Charles Nicholl, a British writer who, I don't know if you've read his stuff. He has written lots of kind of scholarly but very well-written, entertaining things about Shakespeare and Marlowe and all these Elizabethans. He has a book about, the last one I had read was about Shakespeare's time in London. I think it's called Shakespeare in London or something. But this is not at all. Nothing to do with the Elizabethan times or anything. This is about when he's, I can't recall all the details of the story, but basically he's, in a certain sense, against his better judgment, involved in cocaine smuggling, and is trying to track down where the cocaine really comes from. And it starts, and this is in like 1978. As again, the quotation from a review is, pursuing the great cocaine story through the Badlands of Colombia, Charles Nicholl, both sacrificial lamb and recording angel. His Fruit Palace is a compelling, informative, imaginative, and altogether brilliant story.
You've got me intrigued enough to ask on behalf of people out there who may not be familiar with it, nor am I. Is this a confessional of a criminal?
Well, it's no, it's not totally clear that he ever ends up committing any crimes, though he would be willing to, as I recall. I'll just read the opening paragraph. It's one of the great modern travel books, actually, because as he's sort of pursuing this kind of crazed attempt to trace cocaine down to its source, he's going through areas of South America, and he gives you all this fascinating history and everything about them. But see, I'll just start with 2 parts here. It turns out it actually starts when he's being suspected of smuggling in cocaine, and he's worried about even perhaps having his body cavities searched and everything else by British customs. But it turns out there's no need for that. He says, the only problem is this handful of greenish-brown leaves sitting on the pine wood desk in front of me, spilling out a couple of pages of last Wednesday's edition of El Bogotano, the newspaper from Bogota, Colombia. They are coca leaves. To be precise, they are the leaves of Erythroxylum novogranatense, the subspecies of Erythroxylum coca that grows in the temperate mountains valleys of Colombia. I have explained it all carefully. I'm just a writer, a poor hack returning home from an assignment. I brought the leaves back as a souvenir. And the people are a little bit suspicious. But they're kind of he's stopped temporarily, and he says these guys still say, but you're carrying this stuff, why are you carrying this? And they move him to room 1094A. And he says smugglers call these the dead end rooms. The Scot settles down, who's one of the 2 customs officers, settles down the other side of the desk, licks his finger, turns a new page of his notebook and says, right, let's run through this story from the beginning, shall we? Question mark. And and the rest of it is a thing. And then I'll go on for a couple of paragraphs, which is by the time of which I got hooked. If these things have a beginning, I suppose they begin at the Fruit Palace some 12 years ago now. The Fruit Palace was a small, whitewashed cafe, much like thousands of others in Colombia. It stood a couple of blocks from the waterfront in Santa Marta, a hot, scruffy seaport on the northern coast. The wooden sign outside read, El Palacio de las Frutas, Cafeteria, Refresqueria, Residencias. The Fruit Palace. The letters painted in bright, naive colors with a small study in fruit, oranges, mangoes, a half-sliced pineapple in the bottom corner. The specialty of the house was the jugo, or tropical fruit juice, but you could also get the usual range of cheap meals, liquor, provisions, and of course the ubiquitous tinto, a small cup of black coffee that fuels the nation. The Fruit Palace was always open and never crowded. People drifted in and off the street to trade a bit of gossip and rest from the weight of the sun. In the evenings, a few dock workers might come in for a game of 21, with much shouting and slapping down of cards and tossing back of rum. I think Julio, who owned and ran the Fruit Palace, actually preferred business slow. He had dreams of getting rich. He had complex schemes for getting rich, but they were quite divorced from his day-to-day life. Whisking Hugos was something to do for a while he wanted the big one to turn up. With a little bit of sweet and a little bit of sour, he said, man is happy.
Yeah.
And it's just spectacular, and it's just this wonderful combination of kind of lunatic, almost psychedelic adventure story, where with cops and smugglers and life-threatening situations, mixed in with detailed, fascinating history of Venezuela and Colombia and the Andean mountains and stuff like this. And it's a kind of, it's a book that I'm a total sucker for, sort of interesting travel accounts, which are not just, I even read books which just say these are the hotels you should stay in an exotic place. But I love these kind of accounts where I didn't know quite what I was in for when I started this trip. And then you start the trip.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing here, in a single page, it is with the ending of the fellow speaking, it's a standalone little story. And then I would imagine your next page is it could be serve as a standalone. It moves on. It hangs together. It's a full book. But the happy part for me is that I could read it, on the subway for a moment.
You very definitely
in a page, and still get something out of that single page without having to say, "Oh, well, tomorrow maybe I'll understand this."
And I just love those kind of. I might give a plug for myself again available in the
Sawyer Free Library.
My short story fiction collection, The Imminence of God in the Tropics, was chosen by Publishers Weekly to be one of the top, something like the top 5 travel books of the season. But it's not a travel. It's not a travel book in the sense of being a normal thing, right. But it's set in exotic places.
Set in a number of places.
And that's
wonderful.
What I love. So.
I'm going to go back in a moment. I'm going to go back in a moment to your second nonfiction choice, but I want to do this part because we have a chance to know everybody in this picture. John, Yoko, and me. This is John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and me is Elliot Mintz. Elliot Mintz is a partly famous guy down in California. He's a radio broadcaster and a producer and so forth. And he ended up quite in association with John Lennon and Yoko. He interviewed Yoko. Yoko went back to John and said, "This is this fabulous guy. We got to meet him. You got to meet him too." And he then received a phone call from John Lennon and said, more or less, "Come here and meet me." And he did. He flew over to New York and met John. And then there became a great relationship between the three of them, among the three of them, partly because Elliot Mintz is kind of a relatively generous, almost humble person who do errands and arrange for things and try to make other people's lives easier, including these celebrities. What I'd like to do is to quote from a phone conversation. He's wonderful with all this stuff. In other words, if you had to a novelist wants to invent something, he says, "I want to write about John Lennon and Yoko Ono and the breakup of the Beatles and lots of things in their lives before John is killed. I've got to invent a character who will be at their side and with them all the time. And he'll be a radio broadcaster in California who interviewed Yoko and then was called by John and then becomes entangled in their life." It's real. It's true. It's actual. It's not an invented thing or imaginative one. Imagination. Isn't that one of the? Yes. Let me do this. He gets a call from John Lennon, who says he calls Yoko Ono, John calls Yoko Ono mother. Well, I talked to mother, he said. She told me about those weight loss pills you took. I'll try to do the accent too. It's kind of weight loss injections, I corrected him, already surprised by the question and slightly taken aback. Do you have a weight problem, he asked. I didn't. I told him I had put a few pounds on at one point and tried then these somewhat rare injections, but at that moment 2 other thoughts were racing through my mind besides explaining to John that I wasn't overweight. The first was that neither John nor Yoko had the slightest idea what I looked like. I, of course, had seen thousands of images of them, but from their point of view, my physical being was a complete mystery. I was just a disembodied, somewhat monotone voice on the phone. The second thought was that Yoko had obviously been sharing details of our conversations with her husband. I forgot to say, the interview was actually on the telephone. The radio interview that he made. He didn't come to California. Okay, Yoko had obviously been sharing details. What else had she told him about me? Can you get me some? John asked. Can you get me some of them pills? John, I said, there seems to be some confusion here. They aren't pills. They're injections that a doctor gives you. Injections, he repeated. Yes, with a syringe, I said. In your arse or in your arm, he asked. I got mine in my rear end. There was a brief pause. I could all but hear John thinking. Are you sure they don't come in pill form? I'm pretty sure, I said. Is there something I can inject myself? I don't think so. I would mean you need a needle and a drug, and you'd have to know precisely how much to administer. I don't think any doctor would let you do that on your own. For the next few minutes, John went on a semi-rage against the medical establishment. They don't want you to have it in a bloody pill, so you have to go to daddy doctor to get it, he fumed. But there's nothing daddy doctors can do for you that you can't do for yourself. What about open heart surgery, I asked. You can't do that by yourself. He laughed. How do you know? Have you never tried? Look, Elliot, he went on. I'm just looking to appear fit. Can you call around and see if you can get me those injections? Would you do that for me? Now, this is just a few pages, and it's not all hilarious, but there's a lot of things in here. You'd say, what a book. And it's available for free at the Sawyer Free Library. This one is. We All Shine On. That's what I recommend to you for the pleasure of being in the company once more with John Lennon and Yoko. Well, and in their youth, in their time of greatest fame.
Well, I have something just to mention in relation to that. It's not a book, I don't think, but it was a long article I remember reading. It may have been an excerpt from a book. But at one point, there's this woman, I can't remember her name, who was a personal assistant to Yoko. And John was off on a long trip. He was performing some or something, or no, he wasn't performing. I think he was just trying to get away for several weeks. And in the, not the normal kind of relationships we deal with, Yoko wanted to provide a woman for him when he was on his trip to also take care of him and also perhaps report back to Yoko. Yeah. And this woman wrote a long account of life with John as both a temporary surrogate for Yoko, and also as keeping tabs on John for Yoko. And also, it sounded like Yoko Ono was pretty well convinced that John Lennon couldn't take care of himself, even in the most basic areas of daily life, without a helper.
It's worth saying that kind of thing overlaps with this book in a way that just sounds right, sounds truthful now, because of the book, because of my introduction to John in this book. Anyhow, your
Okay,
nonfiction.
my last book, which is not, I've talked about, sort of niche or genre type things. We've had mentioned just to Margaret Atwood's poetry and kids book and a travel book, a true life, true story travel book. And this is another kind of much more restricted little genre, which again my wife was devoted to, but I learned about this book. In fact, I introduced this book to her and read it long before I even met my wife. And she had a lot of interest in kind of scientific feuds, history of science and scientific feuds, different views of dinosaurs. And, in the 19th century, these weren't just kind of like a scholarly discussion at a conference. These are people who, were kind of had their knives out for each other and, were trying to make money off of various things. And this is a more up-to-date scientific feud, which has become, in the past year and a half, has become much more relevant to the general public because one of the figures in the feud is Robert Oppenheimer, and I have not seen the Oppenheimer movie.
I recommend it to you if you haven't.
Good. And one of the characters in that, again, a real life person who is, it doesn't sound to me from what I've read of the movie. He's in the movie. He's played by Josh Hartnett, I believe. I just looked it up. Is E.O. Lawrence. And Lawrence was a great experimentalist in the development of atomic energy. I mean, he kind of, one of the stories which is told in this at great length is his obsession with creating the world's biggest particle accelerator and cyclotron and digging underneath California. And I don't know if this is talked about in the movie.
I thought it was the University of Chicago.
No, that was the first one. And that's the first.
So the second one and bigger one was in California.
Second and bigger. And now the biggest accelerator in the world is in Switzerland. And it's like miles long.
Yeah.
I mean, all it's doing is whirling around this path of 3 or 4 miles, these very tiny fragments of atoms and stuff. And Lawrence is going to build a great big one of that. And Oppenheimer thought it was a crazy idea, and Oppenheimer turned out, it ended up being a complete debacle, whatever. It didn't work. And millions of dollars were spent on it, and it was a problem. But the basic thrust of them was that Lawrence was an experimentalist. He was a tinkerer. He kind of built stuff, right. And like this. And Oppenheimer was a great theoretician, and sometimes they work together, and they work together in building the bomb and stuff. But after the war, it ended up being the bitter fight, which is in the movie, in the political.
Right.
Lawrence was one of the people who sabotaged.
Yes.
Oppenheimer.
Well,
but this book, which I read about all these stories, is published in 1969. I probably read it a year later. It's written by a.
Give us the title again.
It's called Lawrence and Oppenheimer.
Okay.
And and the way it starts is just from a quotation from an article, and says, someone is interviewing Oppenheimer, and says, "Doctor, is it true that from 1943 until recently, at least, you were the most influential scientist in the atomic energy field in this country?" The government lawyer asked Robert Oppenheimer on April 14, 1954. Oppenheimer did not smile. He was being accused of treason. Under oath, he hesitated. I think Lawrence, in many ways, had more influence, he said.
I tell you, that's beautiful.
And then this book goes on to tell.
What I'm summarizing for a purpose.
Yeah.
People out there not only like to read, they also like to write. if you're writing a novel, one of the wonderful devices that you can come up with and work on it, you'll make it happen, is that two people, male or female, or two males, whatever in this instance is two scientists, who hate each other or abhor the presence and hardly want to, if possible, they would exile them to another planet, have to stay together for some reason. Either a top secret important government project, or because they're both struggling with to escape the oncoming volcano in a jeep and nobody else is around. For some reason, those two have to stay together despite all of the antagonism. You know, like when you put two magnets together and they don't want to come together. Those magnets.
This book is very much has that kind of flavor.
Emotional.
Newell Farr Davis, the guy who wrote it, is actually an English professor, or was an English professor from the University of Illinois. He was an expert on Wilkie Collins, who wrote these great horror stories and Gothic mysteries.
The Moonstone.
Yeah.
Allegedly, for those people that are mystery fans, allegedly the first mystery book ever written, Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins.
So this is telling, it's about kind of these dueling scientists, but it's very much told by a guy who knows about how you tell stories and about conflicts, and it's incredibly gripping. I mean, it's
wonderful.
Really,
I mean, nonfiction people out there that want to do something with
this one it's certainly available through Noble, and I think there are also maybe one copy at the Sawyer. So
good.
It's a wonderful.
As it happens, nonfiction people get the benefit. When you write, you sort of in a straitjacket. You can't deviate from the facts. You must be. Nonfiction requires you to be perfectly accurate on what if you're quoting dialogue, you've got to have a reason. You can't speculate or invent, unlike fiction. So what they have, though, is the advantage of using their awareness from the news, from TV, from people telling them where these little instances happen, where their ear will pick it up. There's two people who can't stand each other but have to stay together, and that moves them to say, I've got to write a book about that. And this is transparently what he was unerringly drawn to this controversy, perfectly irrelevant to our time because we live in the atomic age that these two knock heads about. Yeah. I'm going to ask you to think for a moment about Good Harbor Beach. And down near there's a house which many people are familiar with and know it as the T.S. Eliot House, or a house where T.S. Eliot used to spend summers before World War I, before he went to Harvard. And he was originally a St. Louis kid, but he came with his family to Gloucester, Massachusetts for summers. And that's why there's a connection, I think, to Gloucester, and this book is available in the Sawyer Free Library. It's called The Silenced Muse, and it is Emily Hale, T.S. Eliot, and the Role of a Lifetime. It's two people, it's a little deviation of that theme. It's two people who, one is desperately in love, which is T.S. Eliot. He's in love with Emily Hale, and Emily Hale isn't ready for marriage to anybody, and especially to this character. So she turns him down or indicates no interest in him at the time. That frustrates him no end. But he develops essentially a platonic relationship with her, and he's a writer, a poet, playwright. He writes. So he writes letters to Emily Hale all of her life. He writes over 1,000 letters to Emily Hale. And this is even after he married someone else and was with her unhappily for many years and was still writing to Emily Hale, who was a dramatist. She was a theater major. She was interested in performing. She was a celebrated actress in Boston, in Chicago, in California, different places she went on stage. It was legitimate theater. She wasn't a Hollywood actress, but she loved theater and teaching theater. She taught theater in different colleges and places, one of which you would know very instantaneously is Smith College in Northampton. I think she taught, who did she teach there? Well, it became a famous actress. That actress was Smith College wasn't taught for theater. There were 3 women who majored in theater during the time that Emily Hale taught at Smith. And so it wasn't a huge department, but there was enough people to justify its existence. Now, the interesting thing why it's called the Silence Muse is that he kept all 1,000 letters that he sent her. And he, for what? not instantaneously.
Yeah.
But when he married for the second time, he didn't want his later wife, who was going to be with him till he died, to discover this stuff. So he did destroy everything she wrote to him, which must be equal, probably 1,000 letters. So we have an author, Sarah Fitzgerald, who goes through, this is nonfiction.
Yeah.
Sarah Fitzgerald goes through the letters, and newly opened. They were sealed for a while, I think, at Yale University. Then one day came at midnight. You could go in there and look at the letters.
And these are Eliot's letters to her.
Eliot's letter to her.
Yeah.
So finally, she got all this. And this book, as a result, is really a definitive study of this. And the role of a lifetime is, in and out of every chapter, is who's kidding who's pretending, who's on stage, who's not really sincere in what they're writing. Even Eliot, was he really in love with her? Because he left a last letter that wasn't to her. It was to the archivist, who were going to open up all these sealed letters. And the archivist was told, don't believe a thing. I didn't love her at all. She was terrible. She refused me. And who loved who and how many? But his letters were very lyrical in their romantic. And she, on this thing, sometimes she liked him, sometimes she didn't. She'd go to England, supposedly she's going to visit him, then she doesn't, she goes back home without visiting. Who loved who and how much? It's a very interesting, women probably can read this with more understanding than I can, because everybody seems to be kind of screwy in this book. Role of a Lifetime, The Silence Muse. And I'd encourage you to get that book as well. I think we've exhausted the list that we brought today, George.
Yeah, just in time.
And just in time. So we invite you to come back next time in another session. We're real pleased that you stayed with us to the end here, or just turned it on because you're ready for the next program. Whatever you did, thank you very much. Good reading, good writing if you write. And don't forget, we're on again whenever you see Gloucester Bookie. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Tuolla Lontoossa Jennin mä kohtasin. Halo Vepi, oho. Hän on neidosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo Vepi, oho. Suu kuin kirsikka, silmät niin mustat kuin yö. Ja ne loisti kuin tuikkiva tähti.